We are starting a new series today. I love this new series. It's called Route 66. Now, if you're not familiar, you should be. Route 66 is this great, iconic highway that has unique stops all the way along it. And you know, something that's interesting about our Bible is we have 66 books in the Bible. And when we get together, we're kind of like, this person wants to talk about this topic, and this person's favorite Bible study is this. And so the next 7 weeks, we're going to take some unique stops in the Bible that we don't normally talk about. And I am super excited to jump into today. So I have a question for you. Can you think of a time when someone gave you great advice, but you didn't take it? Just think for a second. Can you think of a time when somebody gave you great advice, but you didn't take it? Years ago, about the time that our boys were 5 and 7, we started needing to travel as a family a little bit more due to my business. And as you can imagine, traveling with a 5-year-old and a 7-year-old involved a lot. It involved a lot of luggage. It involved a lot of whining. It involved a lot. And we would take our kids and wake them up at the crack of dawn and pile them in, because those early flights, the ones that cause you to hate your family and start your trip off with death stares, those flights are the cheapest. And so we would do that every time. And then we'd drag our bags through the airport, and we'd go stand at the thing, and we would try to get our tags on our bags, and our kids would be doing whatever kids do, and then we're trying to get the bags to you can all relate to this, right? You're trying to get your bags there, and after we finally got our bags checked in, then we would head to the wonderful thing called security. And we did this over and over and over again, and friends of ours that we traveled with frequently said, why don't you use this? Like, why don't you use curbside check? And Nate and I, in our wisdom, we assumed that curbside check was something you had to pay for. We thought it was probably really complicated, something you had to register for. So trip after trip after trip, we would haul our kids inside and do everything, and our friends would just meet us at the gate with their kids. Until one time, as we arrived late to the airport and near divorce, we decided to try it. And spoiler alert, if you don't know, it's free and it's easy. And they print everything for you, and they put it on the thing, and they don't even weigh your bags most of the time. And you're not pulling your hairdryer out of that one and putting it into this one. And we arrived at the gate. And from that day forward, we have never gone to the counter to check a bag, and our life's been different. And why didn't we do it sooner? Because we're dumb. I don't know. But the real reason, right, is that we thought it was going to be more complicated. And we had a system that worked. Not real well, but it worked. So why change it? And we all do this, don't we? Think about advice somebody's given you. Why do we miss out on it? Sometimes we don't trust the person giving us the advice. Sometimes we think what we're doing isn't broken, so why make it better? This stop on Route 66 today, we're going to be looking at God's advice on something. It's God's advice on rest. He has a plan for it. And I trust him. But I will be honest with you and tell you, I did not take this piece of advice for over 45 years of my life. Because you know what I think we don't recognize often enough? I think we don't recognize that God's laws are gifts. I think, if you're anything like me, in my young life, I looked at God's laws and his rules as restrictions and regulations. They were something for me to obey and to prove that I was good enough to be called a Christian. God's laws were something that judged all of us on this tiered system. I got it all wrong. And then as I grew up as a Christian and I recognized that I was covered by Jesus, I never went back and looked at, so then what's the point of God's laws? They're gifts. They're these gifts that sometimes we don't open. So some of you are here today and you share my thoughts on God's laws. You're still feeling like they're rules and restrictions and something that you have to, weigh into. And I just want you to know that here we want to invite you to know the God we know, who is abounding in love. He's sold out trying to offer you the best life you can possibly have. And each of God's laws are gifts, and they're great advice. And he wants us to live life and live it to the full. Now, when he wants us to live life to the full, he doesn't mean hectic, busy, and worried. That's not in his advice what living life to the full is. So we're going to look at what he has to say about rest. In Genesis, God created the world and everything in it. It was perfect just as he designed it. And this is what we see. It says, on the seventh day, God had finished the work he'd been doing. And so on the seventh day, God rested from all his work. Then God blessed the seventh day. The very beginning, God blessed the seventh day, and he made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work. Then it goes on later in Genesis, and it says, the Lord took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it. It's interesting where it says put him. In the Hebrew, that actually means rested him. So God's perfect design, he said God rested man in the garden to work. So in God's perfect design, when everything was perfect, when there was no sin, there were three things that happened in the world. There was work, there was rest, and there was community. Everybody got to be together. And then, sin happens, everything gets out of whack. Adam and Eve get sent out of the garden. They get sent out of God's presence. Work gets hard. But God always had a plan to rescue people back to him to be in community. And guess what? He also, always from the very beginning, had a plan to restore us to the rest that Adam and Eve got in the garden. It wasn't just to rescue us back to him. His plan was to restore us to rest from the very beginning. So many years after Adam and Eve messed up, and a lot of years before Jesus came to the earth, God's people were enslaved in Egypt. You remember this story? And God sent Moses to get them out of Egypt. He rescues them out of Egypt, and they're in the wilderness. And do you remember how he fed them? He dropped bread from heaven. It was called manna. And guess what? They could only pick up enough for each day. You couldn't pick enough up on Monday to feed yourself for Thursday. You were only allowed to pick up the bread each day, except on the sixth day. And on the sixth day, you could pick up bread for 2 days. Because why? Because on the seventh day, the bread didn't come down, because on the seventh day, God's people were supposed to rest. Because what God was trying to teach them is, look, you've been a slave. For 400 years, all you've known how to do is hurry and hectic and worry and work. And I'm restoring you to me, and I want you to remember that when you're with a loving God, I want you to rest. And so he taught them not through a law at that time. He just taught them through their habit. And then, as he continues to restore them, he gives them 10 rules. We know them as the 10 Commandments. In Exodus, it says this: then, when God gave his people the 10 Commandments, one of them is, remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you should labor and do all your work, but on the seventh day, it's the Sabbath for the Lord. On it you should not do any work. Neither you, nor your son, or your daughter, or your male servant, or your female servant, or your animals, nor your foreigner. Now, I just want to stop real quick. It's Mother's Day. Very rarely in the Old Testament do the women get a shout out, but in this one they do. They're like, look, the guys are going to screw this up, and they're going to think that they get to rest, and you don't. And God's very clear to say male and female rest, okay? And then for 6 days, the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that's in them. But he rested on the seventh day. Therefore, the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So for reference, if you're not really clear, these are one of the 10 Commandments. If you're not familiar with the 10 Commandments, let me tell you real quick. Number 1 was don't have any other gods. Number 2 was don't make any idols. Number 3 was don't take the Lord's name in vain. Number 4 is keep the Sabbath. Number 5 is honor your mom and dad. We're doing that today. Number 6 is don't murder. Number 7 is don't commit adultery. Number 8 is don't steal. Number 9 is don't lie. And number 10 is don't be jealous or greedy. Here's what's interesting about the 10 Commandments. We agree with all of them, except maybe the Sabbath. For some reason, we want to argue about it. We want to ask questions and we want to complicate it. We don't say, why can't I murder? I mean, I do say that sometimes, but with the Sabbath, we sit around and we say, do I have to? Well, what can I do? Well, what can't I do? Well, how do I do it? Well, is it really that important? We don't ask these questions about any one of the other 10 Commandments. And I think it's because it's really easy to miss the point of the Sabbath. And we're not the only people who miss the point of it. During Jesus' time on the earth, he was with his friends, and Luke tells us a story. He says, as Jesus and his disciples were on their way, he came to a village where a woman named Martha opened her home to him. She had a sister called Mary who sat at the Lord's feet just listening to everything he said. But Martha, she was distracted by all the preparations that had to be made. She came in and she asked him, Lord, don't you care that Mary has left me to do all this work myself? Tell her to help me right now. You know that's exactly how she was saying it too, right? We don't need to put our Bible voices on when we read these stories. They're real people. Martha, I love that he says it twice. Can't you just see? She's still dusting. Martha, you are worried and upset about many things, but few things are needed, or indeed only one. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her. See, he says her name, And she's still so focused on everything she's got to get done that he says her name again. I think he wanted to get her attention. And if I'm honest, I think God's trying to get our attention. When's the last time you let God have your full attention? It's easy to judge Martha. But any of us, when we get confused by instructions, we do one of two things. It's like us with the baggage claim or the curbside. When we are confused with instructions, we either dismiss them or we overcomplicate them. So in our head, we couldn't really dismiss that it was there, but in our head, we just overcomplicated it. It'll be way easier to just keep being miserable. Martha dismissed the idea of the value of being at the foot of Jesus. The Jews, the religious leaders of the day, overcomplicated the idea of the Sabbath, and they created hundreds of laws of things you could not do on the Sabbath. They made up a ton of rules. And so then we see in Mark, there's this story that tells of a time that Jesus, on the Sabbath day, healed someone. And the religious leaders were so mad at him because he broke one of their made-up rules. And I love what Jesus said in response. He said to them, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath." In other words, this day is a gift for you to enjoy from God. So when we read these Bible stories, we always put ourselves in the place of the good ones, right? Well, those silly religious leaders. What was wrong with them? So which is worse? Their hard hearts, the religious leaders that complicated God's perfect day of rest, or that today our hard hearts don't observe it at all? See, God's laws are gifts. He's got this advice for us. And you might hear take a Sabbath, and you might think like Nate and I, we got that. We don't need it. What we got going, it's working okay. You know what? I take a couple hours here and there. I don't take a full Sabbath. I just take a few hours this day and a few hours that day. I don't need a full day. You know what? I take a couple weeks vacation a year. And so if you average that out, I'm probably taking my Sabbath. God wants you to live life and live it to the full. And what his advice is to take a complete full day of rest. Not as a hoop to jump through. Not as something to check off, but because he knows what's best for you. And here's a question. When's the last time that you took God's advice and it steered you wrong? I know, it's a tough one, isn't it? It's like we said at the beginning of the message. We all do it. We've all been given great advice that we didn't take. So what do we need to do? We need to figure out how we can actually do this. Because it's one thing to have theory and to say that, but you're all thinking, you ever seen my household? What do you think rest for a whole day? So we need to reframe our thinking. Sabbath isn't a task to complete. It's a gift to enjoy. So I want to spend the last part of our message talking about how do we practically do this in our life. There are 3 steps. So number 1, realize first and foremost, we have to change our brains about this. Rest is a gift, not an oppression. Why do we resist rest? Think about it. Why do we resist rest? There's one reason is we like to accomplish things and we like people to tell us we're good at it. That's just a real thing. I like for people to say, gosh, Rochelle, you're really good at that. Thanks for doing that. Oh my gosh, you're a great multitasker. Oh my gosh, I don't know how you get everything done in a week that you get done. That feels good. And so sometimes we resist rest simply because of affirmation. I have a friend in ministry who said this to me this week. He wrote this about the idea of Sabbath. I came across a note I left on my phone from 5 years ago. This is a minister, by the way, okay? It was a great season of ministry, along with some possible neglect at home because of all the work. Lots of nice comments from people. Eventually, I realized those comments and the way I spent my time was much more successful in feeding my ego than feeding my soul. A healthy soul always outlasts an inflated ego. So step number 1, we just have to realize this is a gift and resist the praise from everybody else and welcome the praise from our Father. Number 2, we got to plan for it. Okay, I had a friend recently that woke up on a Saturday morning and she thought, man, I slept in late. We're going to Sabbath. And it just all went downhill from there. So if you're going to do this, you need to prepare. We prepare for everything else in life. We meal prep, we study for a test, we wash our clothes, we pick up sticks before we mow. We need to prepare before we Sabbath. And the reason why we don't prepare is because our culture has made synonyms out of 2 things. They've said that escaping is resting. So we don't have to prepare to escape. We don't have to prepare to stream a show and binge it. We don't have to prepare to scroll. We don't have to prepare to go through a drive-through, and we don't have to prepare to drink, because those are escapes. But we have to prepare to rest. And then I think we don't prepare for it because we're kind of like, well, what will I do? Resting sounds boring. Because the other thing that we think when we think of rest is napping. There's only so many naps you can take. Now, the moms are like, I'm here for the nap. Okay? But once you're rested, physically, what does rest look like? And here's what it is. It's delighting in who God created you to be. So think about it this. If you work all week with your brain, you need to rest your brain. If you work all week with your body, you need to rest your body. Some of you use both, and you do need to sit and watch a movie. Some of you just need a day without a schedule. What would it feel like to wake up and not know what you're going to do because you get to choose? Maybe it's eating with friends. Maybe it's playing a game. Maybe it's reading or biking. Rest is something that fills your soul, and the Sabbath rest is something that puts you in the presence of God and reminds you you were created for good. Number 3. You just have to remove something that isn't serving you. If you're going to have Sabbath, if you're going to put Sabbath into your life, you're going to have to take something out. And I want to stop here real quick and warn you that this isn't about selfishness. Our culture is all about self-love and self-care. That's not what God is about. God invites us to spend time with him and to be others-focused. And so when we need to remove something, we need to ask ourselves, what are God's instructions for us? I love the way Lisa Turkish said this. She said, how we spend our life is about being more certain of our convictions. Confidence is being certain of our abilities. Conviction is being certain of God's instructions. So let me say it this way. We all want to say yes to things we know we're good at, but just because we have the ability to do something doesn't mean we should. What we need to say yes to are the things God's asking us to do and that he created us to do. And we need to say no to some of the things we might really enjoy so that we can put Sabbath in there. So I have a Mother's Day gift for you. You might have seen it on your chair. Outside of my role here, I do other things. And one of the things I do is teach women and business leaders the law of Sabbath. And one of the things I do is teach them how to get things out of their life and what priorities should be. But one little part of this I felt like was the best Mother's Day gift for every woman here, and that is how to say no. And it has some things there, right? So there's something that you feel like's probably not right for you right now. It's a very good thing. And so society says, well, if you're capable of doing it and somebody asked you to do it, then you should probably do that. But God says, listen to me, spend time with me, and do what I'm calling you to do. So if I need to say no to somebody, there's a little cheat sheet here. And it says things like, well, my heart wants to say yes. The reality of my prior commitments makes me say no. Right now. There's a whole bunch of things and ways to say no. It's my Mother's Day gift to you. Because it's so important. Because we need to learn to give small no's so that we can give the big yes. And what's the big yes? It's Sabbath. If you look at your life and you're like, I am way too busy to take a whole day to rest, then we have to ask ourselves, where are the small no's that we need to be giving? God's laws are gifts. The reality is, he's the best advice giver. You know why? Because he's God and I'm not. And if he says Sabbath is good, then I am determined to believe him. So the question today is, will we accept his advice and trust him? Because God's provision will always outperform our productivity every time.